Well, hello again, and welcome to another episode of Sermon B-Sides. My name is Rusten. I'm one of the pastors at Coram Deo Church, and I'm here with Pastor Jon. What's up, Pastor Jon?
Hey, doing well.
Happy Monday to you.
Happy Monday. Did you get a little a gift basket on your?
Yes, I
on
got
your
a little
chair in your
pastor
office?
appreciation gift basket
Yes.
full of all the curated goodies that people know I like.
Yeah.
Lots of cured meat.
Is that what it was? Yeah.
Yeah. How about you?
Yeah, same
Caffeine.
thing. I got caffeine. I got some Monster and some Coke Zero, and I really love cashews and dried fruit. So there's a bunch of that in there, and some other goodies.
Yeah. Super
Yeah.
super kind and encouraging. It was
Absolutely.
quite a boost to my Sunday yesterday.
Yeah.
Walking into
Not
the
to
office
mention
and seeing
the other things that show up from time to time.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So
but we had our little elder band practice yesterday. So
yeah, we did.
It was a long day.
It was a long day. We had a full Lord's Day morning, and then we jammed. We had some really fun time working out some arrangements, some really interesting arrangements.
Yeah,
some of them are really fun. I'm excited for the elder band playing at Piper and Praise this year.
Yeah, should be fun.
So so
I'm wiped out. You're wiped out, and here we are.
Yep, here we are.
Speaking of wiping out,
I know. I have this residual cough right now that makes me laugh like a smoker every once in a while.
Yeah,
like a smoker. So we're looking at Exodus chapter 9 today.
Yes, sir.
And this is unique because this is one of the few sermons I didn't get to listen to 3 times.
Yeah.
Because it was at our all-church service where we had one service, right? And so we got to hear it once. And this passage, we're looking at basically the pen. Actually, it's not. No, last Sunday's would have been the penultimate plagues. But these are the plagues that things start to get a little more serious because we go from, I love you talk about it like the first plagues are kind of annoyance, right? Mm-hmm. All the plagues are revealing God's lordship over and conquest of pagan gods, right?
Whoa.
But
my desk is going up.
You lost. Oh, you're. That's funny. Going up. Elevator going up.
Speaking of sovereignty.
Yes. So we are the plagues are getting more intense in chapter 9. We go from plagues that are primarily annoyance, although they still reveal God's conquest over and judgment on the Egyptian gods.
Yeah. But
these plagues, things start getting more cranked up because we have plagues that are resulting in loss of life in terms of animal life, and then we have plagues that touch humans in terms of boils, and then we have plagues that cause economic devastation with hail, right?
Yeah. Yep.
And so what is this? I guess before we get the meat of the sermon was about the sovereignty of God, right? The sovereignty of God, and there's a kind of focal point in the sovereignty of God in this passage, which is upon Pharaoh, right? But it's actually undergirding the entire passage too, because all the plagues demonstrate his sovereignty over every realm, all of creation. And so, but could you talk a little bit about like what's up with the escalating plagues? Like things are getting more hot and more intense.
Yes. So one of the things I've tried to mention is on Sundays is that in the plagues you see God's patience. So God doesn't just show up on day 1 and wipe everything out and Moses and the people go free. There is an escalation. It's almost, I'm just thinking this now, it's almost like when Jesus talks about church discipline, there's a process of escalation to it before you remove somebody. Yeah. And so the plagues are kind of like that, in that it starts with significant disconvenience. I likened the gnats and the flies and the frogs to like a really, really terrible camping experience, where it's a real bummer, but everybody's going home in one piece. You're okay. But like you said, it's like the temperature rises and things start hitting closer to home. And so you see God is both patient, but he's serious, right?
Yeah.
he's incrementally increasing the consequences of Pharaoh's sin, not just for Pharaoh and for, but also for Egypt. And so you go from frogs and gnats and flies, and they're, icky and annoying. And then you get to the curse of livestock and, excuse me, crops. And I was trying to, I think it's really easy to not appreciate how devastating that plague would be. Like the only thing, so cattle are, all of your livestock are transportation. It's both money and how you're getting things. You're transporting from something from one town to another town. You're selling grain. You're selling whatever it is, right? You've got animals. Food. It's also food, and it's money. So the only thing I could think of, which I didn't say at the service, but it was like the Canadian truckers protest where they just stopped, right? Like just imagine all transport stopping. And so that's part of what happens when you have the curse on the livestock, because that's how things would go from point A to point B. And imagine all your bank accounts being frozen.
Yeah.
Right? It's like now we're hitting much closer to home. You still don't have loss of human life like you do with the hail that comes later. If anyone is out in the field, they're going to die. And then, of course, the final plague, which is the firstborn sons. But it's definitely increasing in terms of the intensity and the severity and what it's costing Pharaoh and his people, for Pharaoh to not obey God, for him to hold on to Moses and the people.
Yeah, there's a kind of interesting, with the livestock piece, there's an interesting note to make about where the plague comes from, too. There is a revelation of in each one of the plagues about where it comes from, like whether it's from Moses' hand or from the staff or from the waters or from the air, right?
Or from the dust.
And this one, the one where the first time you see life being taken, I think it says it was the hand of the Lord will fall with a severe plague, right? And I think that when I was studying this a while ago, that there's a little bit of I think the Egyptians, they worshipped Osiris, and Osiris was the god of the dead, right? The god of like the idea of death being in his power, right? And there's when it says the hand of the Lord will fall with a severe plague on your livestock so that they die. There's a sense in which God is revealing, I am the one who gives and takes away life.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that actually, this is kind of like hinted. It gets even more intense with the last plague, because the last plague, the taking of the firstborn, there's what you see hinted at here is even more pronounced then, which is getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, because that plague, it says the Lord will come, right?
Yes.
The Lord will come. And it's not like the plague's coming from his hand where he's he's there. He's bringing the plague.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And so we're talking about the sovereignty of God, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think we've talked about this in previous episodes, but I want to repeat it because I think it's really important to say it, that there are commentators and pastors and stuff that will look at the plagues and see them as natural phenomenon. Yeah. And so in their view, God is kind of more, he's like a weatherman. Yeah. Who, these are the things that naturally happen. I think maybe we talked about this in the first couple plagues, that, if you've got piles of frogs that have died, right? There's even going back to the water turning red, there's people who say, well, the Nile would rise and it would bring the dirt back down with it as it went down, and that would cause it to look kind of red, and then that would drive the frogs out of the Nile, and then the frogs would die, and then you've got these massive mounds and piles of dead frogs, and of course you're going to have flies, and then you're going to have flies that are transporting the disease from the frogs to the cattle. And it was probably anthrax. And they've like completely removed God's hand from the equation.
Yeah,
And it's so, when you read the text, it's very clear that God is the one who is doing these things.
absolutely.
It's not God predicting. And I love how the Westminster Confession, as well as the Second London Baptist, the 1689, is that the right year?
1689. Yep.
1689. How they both are careful to say that when we speak of God's foreordaining or predestining or sovereignly arranging things, that they are not saying that God is looking into what would happen given these situations, right, and then kind of like predicting it before it happens, but rather that God is sovereignly ordaining these things.
And so the instances where plagues, originate from certain like locations, like the scripture gives us the locations where his power is demonstrated from, like whether that's to the staff or whether the things, the gnats come from the sky or the east wind.
Yeah.
The person who's not really latching onto the sovereignty of God piece turns those into occasions for understanding their natural occurrences, right?
Yep.
But God working through those, these locations he's not indicating that he wasn't involved sovereignly. He's actually saying something through those locations sovereignly.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. So I love what you talked about with the kilns, right? The boils. Where do the boils come from? Talk about that. Because I think this is a good illustration. Like the person who's trying to like naturally cobble things together to say, oh, this is just, these boils just naturally came about because of, I don't know, ash makes lye, and lye can actually cause chemical burns. Like that's the dumbest, you're missing the point, right?
That's a lot of ash.
That's exactly. So
can Moses and Aaron throw that much ash into the air? I
know, right? So
it's pretty impressive.
Talk about what God is saying. That I think that's really important.
So just real quick before I say that, what you just did, I think, is really important to do when you're dealing with pushback. Is you need to take something to its logical conclusion. You have to take it all the way.
Yeah.
So if you say the plagues are just natural phenomenon, then you have to say, so it was natural that the firstborn of every Egyptian household died. That was natural, right? You got to go all the way through, because people want to play the game halfway. It's like, no, you have to take that sucker all the way through. That's why I'm always concerned with the way people mess with Genesis 1.
Yeah.
And it's like, if you start excluding supernatural whatever, then you're gonna have problems with the whole rest of the Bible. And I'm always like, people want to make Genesis 1. No, this is like an evolutionary process. Well, what do you do when you get to virgin birth and death and resurrection and all? It's like you're in trouble. So, anyways, I just want to point that out. Like, you got to be consistent.
And I'll say that this is, I in my studies, I was particularly surprised by how many conservative commentators go there.
With the plagues?
Yes, with the plagues. Like a lot of people that are on my shelf that I would consider conservative commentators go that direction of there's been some really great evidence uncovered that this is probably natural phenomena. So proving that it's historical is like that doesn't help us.
The Red Sea too?
Yeah.
So anyways, really, the kilns. So there's poetic justice in the Nile being turned to blood because Pharaoh had turned the Nile into a bloodbath for the Jewish males that were born. But particularly with the kiln, right? Kilns that's where you cure the bricks. They're these massive ovens, these furnace where you'd put these bricks in and they'd be heated to this, high temperature, and that would cure the brick. And those bricks are really important in the Exodus story because that was what Pharaoh had forced upon the Hebrew people, that they were to make bricks, and then he made it harder by saying that they had to go get their own straw to make these bricks. So you got to think about, okay, so these Jews had labored for who knows how long and had made how many bricks in these kilns, and the ash from the bricks that they made, which was Pharaoh's curse on the Hebrew people, turns on Pharaoh and becomes a curse on the Egyptian people. So as they're taking these ash from, from the bricks that Moses' people had made, and they're throwing it into the air, it now becomes a curse. And God has a way of turning things on his enemies like that in a very poetic and just way. And it's in a way that it almost makes you kind of laugh, You think about when Paul says we're more than conquerors.
Yeah.
You go, that's part of what that looks like. When the curse that the world puts on God's people, God will turn that and he'll put it on the world.
Yes. And that is even just the imagery of sores on the body coming from this ash, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where the slaves were forced ostensibly, through physical harsh
coercion,
means, to make these bricks. I mean, the image in my mind, this is extra textual. You don't get this in the text, but I get the image of my mind of how, I think chapter 1 of Exodus talks about how they put harsh burdens upon them and force them to hard labor. Yeah. And the language, the imagery I get in my mind is of, slaves that have like stripes on their backs because they're being, whipped into submission to, do whatever tasks is upon them. And then here you have the ash, returning to the people who were oppressing these slaves in the form of boils and sores upon their body. Yeah, there's absolutely. That's a kind of definitely a kind of poetic justice.
Yeah, and there's another connection I tried to talk about yesterday in chapter 10. Just want to make sure it's here. But when the curse of the boils come, as like with the other plagues, it's not just Pharaoh. And it's not just the slave masters. Mm-hmm. There is it doesn't say this, but it's as if Pharaoh is like the representative head of Egypt. So when Pharaoh is cursed, Egypt is cursed. When Pharaoh rebels, like we saw, there's darkness in the land. God is judging all of Egypt because of what Pharaoh is doing and has done. Mm-hmm. It's important to make that connection. It's not just Pharaoh who's being judged. It's the land of Egypt. Like you hear, there was blood in the land. There were frogs in all the land. There was gnats, right? It's the land.
Yeah, and there's several points. I mean, the livestock situation, and I believe also the I'm not sure if it's abundantly clear with the boils, but these plagues, there's distinctions being made between God's people and the Egyptians. Yeah. And so you have
it starts with I think the fourth plague of the flies.
Yeah, so where there's distinctions. Yeah.
God is making a distinction between his people, which again just highlights his sovereignty. There's no natural explanation for it. And I heard people talking about, well, the land of Goshen was located in this, and so the wind,
exactly.
Like, oh my gosh, you guys.
So
you're trying too
but then
hard.
What do you do about the blood on the doorposts? Right? It's like, So there's an interesting point made in this passage about the magicians, right? This passage makes sure to bring up that the magicians were too struck with the sores that they couldn't actually stand before Pharaoh. Yeah, and I find that really there's a lot of irony there, given they're kind of like they think they're standing up to Moses in the beginning. Yeah, right. We can do it. We can do this too. We can do this too. And then like they can't even come. They can't even come to work.
Maybe they've wised up a little bit, because remember, like early on when Pharaoh or when Moses would bring a plague, like they would multiply it. They would just make it worse. Like, see, we can do it. So it's like, so they get afflicted with boils. Like, no, I'm not reproducing.
I don't want any more of those. I don't want any more. I'm already covered. Yeah, exactly.
They're like,
yeah. And then you have the hail plague. And it's made clear that only in the land of Goshen was where the hail didn't fall. Yeah. But so let's talk now about the kind of the central piece of your sermon, which was in this passage you have several instances where it's made explicit that God is the one who hardens the heart of Pharaoh so that he does not let the people go.
Mm-hmm.
Even in the midst of increasing, like this is where the plagues go beyond annoyance. Now they're like, this is having some real economic and personal devastation upon him and all of the people under him. So he's actually, there's kind of like, if you're in the mind of a tyrant, you kind of have, you are juggling trade-offs. Like, do I lose my my pride by letting these slaves go, or do I lose the people through continuing these plagues that are causing nonsense, right? And or all kinds of devastation. So but I mean again, you could try to figure out the mind of Pharaoh, but what we know is that God hardened his heart.
Yeah.
Right. And there's an insanity there because of what he's seeing, at this point, at the end of this chapter, he's seen, I think it's seven instances of God's sovereign power over nature and all the things that he thought he had some semblance of control over. So what do we need to take away about the sovereignty of God and hardening Pharaoh's heart?
So the when you see God's sovereignty in the plagues, I think that may be easier for people to wrap their heads around. Yeah. I think where you have a lot of problems is when it comes to God hardening Pharaoh's heart. And people who aren't familiar with the text, I think may be tempted to go, oh, you're just some hyper-Calvinist reformed. You're reading into things. It's like, no, the text actually says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. And people can play, and if you read the commentaries, you'll run into people who play games with it, going, well, Pharaoh hardened his heart first, and then God only hardened it after. And it's just like, what the one commentator, Peter Enns. Have you ever read him?
Yes, I have.
Okay, so some of his stuff is like, it's okay, but on this issue, I really like him. Because he's like, the text is not interested in at all in resolving that tension. It's just telling us that God hardened Pharaoh's heart, and it means what it says. Yeah. And I think once you start to try and like explain, well, how all these things work together and God's sovereignty and
you're missing the point.
You're missing the point. And honestly, people are, this is my opinion, people are more concerned with upholding the freedom of the individual than they are with upholding the sovereignty of God. And that's a problem.
Yeah. Yes.
People would rather have an autonomous human being that is free to do whatever than they would to have a God who is sovereign over all things. And it's not that those things are also in conflict, which the Westminster and the Second London Baptist also are clear to point out, that it's not doing violence to the will of a human being. We don't know how this works, but we do know what the text says. And it says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. And God is clear in saying that he did it for a reason. Yep. It doesn't say he did it because Pharaoh had previously hardened his heart. It says that he hardened his heart so that he may be raised up, and that through this ongoing conflict that all of Egypt would know that God is God. And Paul looks back to this exact chapter, right? This exact episode, and he gives commentary on it. And I don't know a better commentator on the Old Testament than Paul, inspired by the Holy Spirit. But
so abundantly clear, what Paul says.
It's absolutely clear. So I'm just going to read it in Romans 9. It says, "For the scripture says to Pharaoh." So I love Paul's like, well, what's the Bible say? "For this very purpose I have raised you up, that I might show my power in you, and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth." And then so Paul's quoting Exodus, and then Paul applies that in principle. "So then he has mercy on whomever he wills, and he hardens whomever he wills." And then he anticipates somebody going, wait, that's not fair. In verse 19, "You will say to me then, why does he still find fault? For who can resist his will?" So if God's will is for, to harden Pharaoh's heart, how can it be Pharaoh's fault that God hardened his heart?
Because no one can resist his will.
Right.
So thus,
And Paul's anticipating that question. And that tells us that what we think Paul just said is exactly what Paul said. If you understand what Paul's saying, this is the question that you should ask, right? If God is actually sovereign over Pharaoh's heart and hardens it, then how can Pharaoh be held accountable to it? And Paul's response in verse 20 is, but who are you, O man, to answer back to God? And I just love that. There's not some deep exploration of the intricacies of human freedom and will and God's sovereignty. He's just like, you're asking God to answer to you?
Yeah. It reminds me of
That's
Job.
crazy.
It reminds me of Job.
Yeah.
Because Job is like this really long book of people trying to like analyze a situation, and all of the analysis is just silenced by God showing up and revealing, asking questions like, where were you when, when the sons of God rejoiced at the creation of the world? Where were you when I hung the stars? Right? Like, he's just completely limiting, like, basically, like, who is man that God is mindful of him? Yet he is mindful of him. And yet, like, are you going to question God? That's, it basically, it says the answer is look at who God is. That's the answer.
That's the answer. Yeah.
Yeah. You don't sit in judgment upon this God.
That's right.
He's sovereign.
Yeah. So he's sovereign over everything, and whatever he ordains is what comes to pass. Yes.
And so there's obviously here you mentioned it a little bit. There's I feel like when you get in conversations with people about this topic, the people who disagree with what the Bible says, I'm just going to say that's the people who don't believe the Bible, will basically think that there's only two options. It's either, man is his own ultimate determiner, like that puts freedom of the human will above God's sovereignty.
Yeah.
Or a hyper-Calvinist understanding of reality and things, right?
Yeah.
And because they want to,
Will you explain hyper-Calvinist real quick?
Yeah.
I can anticipate somebody going, what is that? Like just a really obnoxious Calvinist?
A Calvinist after his coffee.
After his
Red
Monster
Bull.
and Red Bull.
Exactly. That's a
Calvinist with ADD.
Yeah. So a hyper-Calvinism, and it's important to say that historically, this is not just a straw man. There have been historic hyper-Calvinists that have been in places of authority in the church, and entire denominations that have been based upon a hyper-Calvinist understanding of God and his will and his sovereignty. So, for instance, hyper-Calvinists will believe that, God, because he's all sovereign, there's basically there's no point in man's action, right?
Yeah.
There's no point in praying. There's no point in doing, the biggest thing I could think of historically was world missions.
Yeah.
Right.
Evangelism. Yeah.
Evangelism. Exactly.
Yep.
If God's going to save, God's got the people he's going to save. He has the elect. There's no it's very fatalist in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Because it's like what's going to happen is going to happen. And it almost, what it does is it removes, it takes the sovereignty of God to the point where it removes human responsibility.
Yeah.
And so for instance, William Carey, father of modern world missions, had to fight his denomination tooth and nail to like allow him to go be a missionary in India, because they were operating on hyper-Calvinist assumptions that if God has people in India, he'll save them. Yeah. We don't need to go out there. Yeah. Which is to completely, Calvinism, it's completely against the scriptures.
It's inconsistent with itself.
Yeah, exactly.
I remember I want to say it was R.C. Sproul, who I think it was maybe like some sort of conference, and somebody, everybody is going to ask the question, like, if God, because R.C. Sproul was the guy who really introduced me to the doctrines of grace and election, and actually understanding them, biblically. And there's always the question, like, if God has predestined, if God's sovereignty has determined who will be saved and who will be damned, then why should we evangelize? And his response was, because the sovereign Lord who ordained it also told you to go do it.
Exactly.
Like,
as simple as that.
It is as simple as that.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I believe the confessions will also say something to the tune of, God not only ordains what comes to pass, but the means.
The means,
right?
Yep.
He doesn't
Yep.
just ordain the ends, but he ordains the means. So this is actually super encouraging for Christian action.
Yes. Yeah.
Because it means that if I go and evangelize my neighbors, that's the ordained means by which God calls his elect to himself.
Right. Right.
If I pray for God, the Lord's Prayer, for instance, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. He gave us those words because he actually has ordained that end to come through the prayers of his people.
Yeah.
So it actually elevates human action and responsibility to a point of hope, like very encouraging hope, right? Because not only am I called to responsibility, but I have this promise that actually that's the way God works.
Yeah.
He's ordained not just the ends, but the means.
Yeah. J.I. Packer wrote a book on God's sovereignty and evangelism.
Yes.
I don't remember what it's called, but
Evangelism, the sovereignty of God.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, imagine that. There's this great one-liner in there where he says, everybody who prays for the conversion of a friend is functionally a Calvinist.
They are. Yes.
Or believes in God's sovereignty as it relates to salvation. Because when somebody prays, God softens somebody's heart. What did you say?
Exactly.
God softened their heart. Well, why did you say that? Because you believe
he can.
God is
does
able.
That.
He can. That's right.
Yeah,
she's right. And that's a segue to like where I ended the sermon on Sunday with the freedom that Moses has.
Yeah.
In knowing that God is sovereign.
Yep.
And that Moses does not have to figure out how to negotiate this or thread the needle or, it's like he just needs to do what God told him to do. And God told him beforehand what he was going to do. That's the beauty of it. He's like, you're going to go to Pharaoh. I'm going to harden his heart. He's going to say no. You're going to go back and forth. Just keep doing it. And I think that there's sometimes, especially when it comes to like missions or outreach, that you can get so caught up in doing it just the perfect way to produce the desired results. And there's a lot of freedom in just knowing, and it doesn't mean that we need to be irresponsible or unprepared,
Yeah. But it also maybe guards us from a form of pragmatism that might, like there's a kind of pragmatism that says we don't need to do what God says to do because we can actually achieve ends through, I'm thinking about like Paul's talking about we don't tamper with the word, right?
That's right.
Like we just obey and do what God says and we proclaim his word and he's the one who brings the harvest.
Yeah, that's right. And so there's freedom in that to just trust him and obey. Somebody should write a hymn about that.
Well, I think that's a really good word on God's sovereignty and our responsibility as well, which God's sovereignty does not negate our responsibility. And so I think that's a good place to end it today.
Cool.
Until next time, trust Christ, go to church, and love your neighbor. See ya.
See ya.